May the 2nd, 1945. Berlin is burning. Soviet tanks are rolling through the streets. Adolf Hitler has been dead for 2 days. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, has lasted 12. Germany's surrender is imminent. In a nondescript building near the Tempelhof airport, a middle-aged man in a Wehrmacht uniform is burning documents. Page after page feeds into the flames. Names, addresses, bank accounts, escape routes. He's worked in the Reich Security Main Office for years, coordinating some of the most horrific crimes in human history. Now, he's erasing every trace of his existence. By May 5th, this man has vanished. His uniform is found abandoned in an alley. His identification papers are destroyed. His colleagues will later claim they never really knew him. He's become a ghost. His name is ADOLF EICHMANN, and he won't be seen again for 15 years. He's not alone. As Nazi Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, thousands of officers, officials, and war criminals simply disappeared. Some fled to South America with new identities. Others hid in plain sight in Germany itself. A few were spirited away by intelligence agencies who valued their expertise more than justice. And some, the most disturbing cases, were helped by networks within the Catholic Church that valued anti-communism over accountability. This is the story of the Nazi officers who vanished after the war. Some were eventually found and brought to justice. Others lived free for decades, dying peacefully in bed while their victims' families still searched for answers. And a few were never found at all, their fates remaining mysteries to this day. These aren't just stories of escape. They're stories about the failure of justice, the complicity of institutions, and the terrible truth that sometimes the worst criminals in history get away with it. Let's begin with the most infamous disappearance of all, the architect of the Holocaust himself, Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat of death. Adolf Eichmann wasn't a soldier. He never commanded troops in battle, never fired a weapon in combat, never wore a chest full of medals. He was a bureaucrat, a middle manager in the sprawling apparatus of Nazi genocide. And yet, he was responsible for the deaths of millions. Eichmann joined the SS in 1932 and quickly found his niche, logistics. While others focused on ideology or military glory, Eichmann became an expert in transportation, scheduling, and administration. By 1942, he was the head of the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs section, which meant he was in charge of organizing the deportation of Jews from across Europe to extermination camps. He was terrifyingly good at it. Eichmann treated genocide like a supply chain problem. He coordinated train schedules, negotiated with railroad authorities, calculated the optimal number of people per cattle car. He created systems to ensure maximum efficiency, from the identification and roundup of victims to their arrival at death camps. When Hungary's Jews were being deported in 1944, Eichmann personally oversaw the operation, ensuring that 12,000 people per day were being shipped to Auschwitz. He did all of this from behind a desk, using forms and memos and bureaucratic procedures. Hannah Arendt would later call it the banality of evil, the idea that the worst atrocities can be committed by ordinary people following ordinary procedures. But as the war turned against Germany, Eichmann began planning his escape. In late 1944, he started building his exit strategy. He collected false papers, established contact with escape networks, and began moving money to neutral countries. He was methodical about it. The same organizational skills he'd used to murder millions were now being applied to his own survival. When Berlin fell in May 1945, Eichmann disappeared. Josef Mengele, the angel of death. If Eichmann was the bureaucrat of the Holocaust, Josef Mengele was its mad scientist. Mengele was an SS physician stationed at Auschwitz from 1943 to 1945. His job was to conduct selections, deciding which prisoners would be worked to death and which would be gassed immediately. But Mengele went far beyond his official duties. He conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners, particularly twins and people with genetic abnormalities. He injected chemicals into children's eyes to see if he could change their color. He performed surgeries without anesthesia. He infected prisoners with diseases to study their progression. He attempted to create conjoined twins by surgically connecting children. Survivors remembered him whistling opera tunes as he selected victims for the gas chambers, always impeccably dressed, always smiling. They called him the Angel of Death. When the Soviet army approached Auschwitz in January 1945, Mengele fled. Unlike Eichmann, who went to ground in Germany, Mengele immediately headed south. By May 1945, he'd made it to Bavaria, where he hid with friends and former SS comrades. For the next 4 years, Mengele lived under various aliases in Germany, working as a farmhand. He was actually captured by American forces in 1945, but his captors didn't realize who they had. Mengele's name wasn't yet on the major war criminals list, and his SS blood group tattoo, which identified SS members, had been removed. He simply claimed to be a regular Wehrmacht soldier and was released. By 1949, with war crimes investigations intensifying, Mengele decided it was time to leave Europe entirely. Like Eichmann, he made his way to Argentina via the Ratlines. In Buenos Aires, Mengele lived openly under his own name. He even obtained Argentine citizenship in 1956. He worked for a German pharmaceutical company, socializing with the German expatriate community, and lived comfortably on money sent by his wealthy family in Germany. But unlike Eichmann, Mengele sensed danger earlier. When Eichmann was captured in 1960, Mengele panicked. If the Israelis could kidnap Eichmann from Argentina, they could do the same to him. Within weeks of Eichmann's capture, Mengele fled Argentina for Paraguay, which had even laxer extradition laws. In Paraguay, Mengele lived on a remote farm owned by a German immigrant. He kept a low profile, rarely traveling to cities, communicating with his family in Germany through coded letters. But he was becoming paranoid. He saw threats everywhere, trusted no one, and moved constantly. By 1960, Mengele was one of the most wanted men in the world. Israel's Mossad wanted him. German prosecutors wanted him. Holocaust survivors wanted him. Rewards for information leading to his capture reached millions of dollars. And yet, he stayed free. In 1961, Mengele moved again, this time to Brazil. He lived with a Hungarian couple, Wolfram and Lieselette Bossert, who knew his identity but protected him anyway. He worked odd jobs, stayed out of sight, and waited for the world to forget about him. The manhunt continued for decades. In the 1970s, reports placed Mengele in Paraguay, Chile, Brazil, and even back in Europe. Every lead was investigated, every rumor was checked. The search consumed enormous resources and involved multiple countries' intelligence services. But Mengele was always one step ahead. The truth about Mengele's fate remained unknown until 1985, when investigators finally caught a break. The Bosserts, now elderly and feeling guilty, told authorities that Mengele had died years earlier, in 1979, from a stroke while swimming at a beach in Brazil. Forensic investigators exhumed a body from a grave in São Paulo. Dental records and bone analysis confirmed it. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, had died peacefully in 1979, never facing trial, never being held accountable for his crimes. He'd been dead for 6 years before the world even knew he was gone. The Mengele case represents the most frustrating aspect of Nazi disappearances. Sometimes they win. Sometimes the criminals get away with it completely, living for decades under assumed names, dying in comfort while their victims' families wait for justice that never comes. But how did so many Nazis manage to escape? The answer involves networks that should have been hunting them, but instead were helping them vanish. The Ratlines. How they escaped. The escape of thousands of Nazi war criminals wasn't accidental. It was systematic, organized, and facilitated by a network of institutions and individuals that should shock us to this day. The so-called Ratlines were escape routes that moved Nazi fugitives from Germany to safe havens, primarily in South America. These weren't improvised escape attempts. They were sophisticated operations involving false papers, safe houses, transportation networks, and diplomatic connections. And one of the most disturbing aspects? The Catholic Church was deeply involved. After the war, the Vatican maintained a network of monasteries, churches, and aid organizations across Europe. Officially, these were intended to help refugees and displaced persons. But certain clergy members, particularly those who were virulently anti-communist, saw Nazi fugitives as valuable allies in the coming Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union. The most notorious figure in this network was Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian bishop based in Rome. Hudal was openly sympathetic to fascism and had maintained connections with Nazi leadership during the war. After 1945, he ran what was essentially an underground railroad for escaping Nazis. Here's how it worked. a fugitive Nazi would make his way to Italy, often with help from former SS networks still operating in Germany and Austria. Once in Italy, he'd make contact with Hudal's organization. The bishop would provide shelter in a monastery or church property, where Italian authorities wouldn't search. Then came the paperwork. The International Committee of the Red Cross, incredibly, was issuing travel documents to refugees with minimal verification of identity. A Nazi fugitive would claim to be a displaced person from Eastern Europe, unable to return home due to communist takeover. Hudal's organization would provide supporting documents, often completely fabricated. With Red Cross papers in hand, the fugitive would then apply for a visa to Argentina, Paraguay, or Brazil. These countries were actively recruiting European immigrants and asking few questions about their backgrounds. The Catholic Church's diplomatic connections smoothed the process. Within months, a wanted war criminal could go from hiding in a Bavarian farmhouse to living openly in Buenos Aires. Thousands of Nazis escaped this way. Eichmann used this route. So did Mengele. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, traveled this way to Bolivia. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka death camp, made it to Brazil via the Ratlines. Erich Priebke, responsible for the Ardeatine massacre in Italy, escaped to Argentina. But the Ratlines weren't just run by sympathetic clergy. Intelligence agencies also played a role, for very different reasons. The United States and Soviet Union were both interested in Nazi scientists, intelligence officers, and technical experts. Rather than prosecute these individuals for war crimes, they recruited them. Operation Paperclip, run by the US, brought over 1,600 German scientists and engineers to America after the war. Many had been Nazi party members. Some had used slave labor in their work. But their expertise in rockets, aviation, and chemical weapons was considered too valuable to waste. Werner von Braun, who developed the V-2 rocket using slave labor from concentration camps, became a hero of the American space program and is celebrated as a pioneer of space exploration. His past was quietly buried. The Soviets did the same thing on the eastern side, grabbing German scientists and technicians and putting them to work on Soviet missile and aircraft programs. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies on both sides recruited former Nazi intelligence officers who had expertise in Soviet affairs. The Gehlen organization, made up of former Wehrmacht intelligence officers, was actually funded and run by the CIA for years. The fact that these men had committed atrocities during the war was considered less important than their knowledge of Soviet operations. All of this created a post-war environment where hunting Nazi war criminals was never the priority. The Cold War took precedence. Former enemies became useful assets, and thousands of Nazi officers simply walked away from justice. Klaus Barbie, the butcher protected by the CIA. Klaus Barbie's story perfectly illustrates how Nazi war criminals were protected by the very institutions that should have been hunting them. Barbie joined the SS in 1935 and rose through the ranks to become the Gestapo chief in Lyon, France, during the Nazi occupation. His methods were so brutal that he earned the nickname, the Butcher of Lyon. Barbie personally tortured hundreds of French resistance members. He ordered the deportation of thousands of Jews, including 44 children from an orphanage in Isieux, who were sent directly to Auschwitz. He had resistance leader Jean Moulin tortured to death. Survivors described Barbie as sadistic, personally participating in torture sessions and seeming to enjoy the suffering he caused. When Germany surrendered, Barbie was one of the most wanted war criminals in France. French authorities had extensive documentation of his crimes and were determined to see him hanged. But American intelligence had other plans. In 1947, the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, recruited Barbie as an intelligence asset. His expertise in communist resistance movements was considered valuable for the emerging Cold War. For 2 years, Barbie worked for American intelligence, providing information on communist activities in Europe. When French authorities discovered that Barbie was in American custody and demanded his extradition, the CIC refused. Instead, in 1951, they helped him escape. Using Ratline networks similar to those that moved Eichmann and Mengele, the CIC arranged for Barbie to travel to Bolivia under the alias Klaus Altmann. They provided false papers, transportation, and even financial support for his new life. For the next 30 years, Klaus Barbie lived openly in Bolivia. He worked as a businessman and, incredibly, as a consultant for the Bolivian military and intelligence services. He advised on counterinsurgency techniques, interrogation methods, and internal security. essentially teaching the Bolivian government the same torture techniques he'd used in Lyon. During Bolivia's military dictatorship in the 1970s and 1980s, Barbie was allegedly involved in the regime's brutal repression of dissidents. He'd gone from torturing French resistance fighters to training South American dictatorships in torture. The skills were transferable. The hunt for Barbie continued throughout these decades, led primarily by French Nazi hunters Bitte and Serge Klarsfeld. They tracked rumors, interviewed witnesses, and gradually pieced together evidence that Klaus Altmann was actually Klaus Barbie. In 1972, they found him. Journalists confronted Barbie in La Paz, but the Bolivian government refused to extradite him. Bolivia had no extradition treaty with France, and Barbie had powerful friends in the military regime. It took another decade and a change in Bolivian government before Barbie was finally arrested in 1983. He was extradited to France and put on trial in 1987, 42 years after the war ended. The trial was a sensation. Survivors testified about Barbie's cruelty. Documents showed his role in deportations and executions. Barbie himself showed no remorse, claiming he was a soldier following orders. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 1991, at age 77. But the Barbie case revealed something darker than just one man's escape. It showed that Western governments had actively protected Nazi war criminals when it served their interests. The same institutions that publicly condemned Nazi atrocities were privately employing Nazi criminals and helping them evade justice. How many other war criminals received similar protection? How many were recruited by intelligence agencies and given new identities? The full extent of this collaboration may never be known, as many records remain classified to this day. The ones who were never found. For every Eichmann captured and every Mengele whose death was eventually confirmed, there are Nazi officers whose fates remain complete mysteries. They vanished after the war and were never seen or heard from again. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief. Heinrich Müller was head of the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. He was one of the most powerful men in the Nazi regime, directly responsible for implementing Hitler's racial policies and overseeing the detention, torture, and murder of millions. Müller was last seen in Hitler's bunker in Berlin on May 1, 1945, the day after Hitler's suicide. Then he vanished. His body was never found. His fate was never determined. Theories abound. Some believe he died in the Battle of Berlin and was buried in an unmarked grave. Others think he escaped to Switzerland or South America. The most controversial theory suggests he was recruited by Soviet intelligence and lived out his life in the USSR. Despite extensive investigations, no conclusive evidence of Müller's fate has ever emerged. He's listed as missing, presumed dead, but no one knows for sure. Aribert Heim, the doctor who got away. Dr. Aribert Heim was an SS doctor at Mauthausen concentration camp, where he conducted lethal experiments on prisoners. Survivors called him Dr. Death for his sadistic surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. After the war, Heim worked as a gynecologist in Germany under his own name. Incredibly, no one investigated him for years. By the time Austrian authorities issued an arrest warrant in 1962, Heim had disappeared. For decades, investigators believed Heim was living in South America, possibly Chile or Uruguay. In 2009, German media reported that Heim had actually died in Egypt in 1992, living under an assumed identity as a Muslim convert. Documents and testimonies seem to support this claim, but many investigators remain skeptical. No body was produced. The evidence was circumstantial. Some believe Heim's death in Egypt was an elaborate deception and that he died elsewhere, or possibly lived even longer. Alois Brunner, the most wanted Nazi. Alois Brunner was one of Eichmann's top deputies, personally responsible for deporting over 128,000 Jews to death camps. After the war, he escaped to Syria, where he lived openly under the protection of the Syrian government. For decades, Brunner worked as an advisor to the Syrian regime, allegedly training Syrian intelligence in interrogation techniques. He gave occasional interviews boasting about his role in the Holocaust, showing no remorse. The last confirmed sighting of Brunner was in 2001 in Damascus. Reports of his death began circulating in the 2000s, with various sources claiming he died in 2001, 2010, or 2015. The Simon Wiesenthal Center declared him dead in 2014, but Syrian authorities never confirmed it. Brunner's case is particularly galling because everyone knew where he was. He wasn't hiding. He was living under the protection of a government that valued his anti-Israeli stance more than justice for his victims. Multiple assassination attempts were made. He lost an eye and fingers to letter bombs, but he was never captured or extradited. Richard Glucks, the camp system administrator, SS General Richard Glucks, was the inspector of concentration camps, directly overseeing the entire camp system including Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau. He was responsible for implementing the logistics of industrial-scale murder. Glucks was last seen in Flensburg, Germany, in May 1945. Then he disappeared completely. Some reports suggest he committed suicide, but no body was ever found or identified. Others believe he escaped and lived under an assumed name. Despite being one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals, Glucks has never been found, and his ultimate fate remains unknown. You might be thinking, why does this matter now? These events happened 80 years ago. Most of the perpetrators are long dead, whether they face justice or not. Why revisit these stories? Because the disappearance of Nazi officers after the war represents a collective failure that echoes into the present. It was a failure of justice. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted major leaders, but thousands of lower-ranking officers and officials, the people who actually implemented the Holocaust, who ran the camps, who pulled the triggers, escaped accountability. The message was clear. If you're important enough or useful enough to the right people, you can get away with anything. It was a failure of institutions. The Catholic Church prioritized anti-communism over justice. Intelligence agencies valued expertise over accountability. Governments chose Cold War advantages over moral responsibility. These weren't random mistakes. They were deliberate choices made by institutions we're supposed to trust. It was a failure of memory. For decades, many countries tried to move on without fully confronting what had happened. Germany's denazification was incomplete. Austria portrayed itself as a victim rather than a willing participant. Countries that harbored Nazi fugitives denied their presence even when evidence was overwhelming. These failures have consequences that persist today. When Klaus Barbie trained South American military dictatorships in torture techniques, he was passing on lessons learned in Nazi-occupied France. When scientists brought to America under Operation Paperclip shared their knowledge, they were benefiting from expertise gained through slave labor and human experimentation. The past doesn't stay in the past. Moreover, the mechanisms that allowed Nazi officers to disappear, false papers, corrupt officials, institutional protection, international indifference, are the same mechanisms that allow war criminals to escape justice today. From Rwanda to Bosnia to Syria, we've seen the same patterns. Atrocities committed, perpetrators fleeing, justice delayed or denied. The Simon Wiesenthal Center and other organizations continue hunting the last surviving Nazi war criminals. Most are now in their 90s or older. Some have been found living quietly in New York, Minnesota, Germany. The investigations continue because societies decided, however belatedly, that there must be no statute of limitations on genocide. But time is running out. Soon, all the perpetrators will be dead. The last survivors are also dying. The living connection to these events is fading. What remains is the responsibility to remember, not just what happened, but what happened afterward. How war criminals escaped, who helped them, which institutions failed to stop them, and what we've learned, or failed to learn, from these failures. In the chaos of 1945, as Germany surrendered and Europe began counting its dead, thousands of Nazi officers made a calculation. They could face justice for their crimes, or they could disappear. Many chose to disappear, and a disturbing number succeeded. They lived under assumed names in South America, worked for intelligence agencies that should have arrested them, enjoyed protection from institutions that claimed moral authority, and in many cases died peacefully, never facing consequences for the horrors they'd committed. ADOLF EICHMANN was caught, but only after 15 years and extraordinary efforts. JOSEF Mengeles died free. Klaus Barbie lived comfortably for 3 decades under CIA protection. Heinrich Müller was never found. Alois Brunner lived openly in Syria, protected by a government that valued his hatred of Jews more than justice. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders that justice is never automatic. It requires effort, resources, courage, and a collective commitment to accountability. When societies fail to pursue justice, when they prioritize other concerns, when they decide to move on, when they protect the guilty for political advantage, they're making a choice about what kind of world they want to live in. The hunt for Nazi war criminals continues to this day, even as the last survivors reach the end of their lives. It continues not because punishment still matters. Most are too old for meaningful imprisonment, but because justice matters. Accountability matters. Truth matters. And remembering how badly we failed the first time matters, so we don't fail again. If you found this deep dive into history important, hit that subscribe button for more untold stories from World War II and beyond. Drop a comment about what aspects of post-war justice you think we've learned from, or failed to learn from. And let me know what other dark corners of history you'd like me to explore. Thanks for watching. Remember, the price of justice is eternal vigilance, and the cost of forgetting is measured in unpunished crimes and repeated atrocities.